Well, more on Syria now from anti-war activist and journalist Don Debar, who's extensively covered civil conflicts in Arab countries. There you are. With the rebels officially pulling out of the truce, Don, do you think the UN idea of mediating peace in Syria is now dead? Is this over?
Well, the United States is trying to kill it, but it's absolutely essential that some sort of a peace, oriented mission take place, or there will be bloodshed, horrible bloodshed in Syria that'll make Libya look like a picnic. The United States has been very clear from the outset, really, of the activity in Syria that they want to see Assad gone. They have geopolitical reasons for that, particularly the relationship with Iran and the military base, the naval base of Russia in the north, in Tartus. And they really don't seem to care about what the facts are. In this particular case of the recent massacre, the outrage that people rightly feel over that can't be blinded by a failure to do fact-finding, to find out who, in fact, was responsible. And so the blame is being laid at the regime's feet in the media in the Western world, like wall to wall, from CNN and those, Fox, etc., to even the progressive media, so-called here. And there's been no fact-finding yet.
And how much is that? I mean, the media and also the West as a whole blaming constantly President Assad for all the violence and talking increasingly about foreign intervention, how it's needed, how it's the only way. How much does that affect the rebels' decision to make these kind of announcements that they want to?
Well, that's exactly what they're playing to. And what's unfortunate is that every side that speaks with the Syrian people finds and has to report that the Syrian people do not want intervention from outsiders. They have historically resisted it, and wherever it's expressed in polling data and the more than 50% turnout in the parliamentary elections earlier this month and the strong support for the regime in those elections, to the referendum on a new constitution earlier this year, there is no doubt that the Syrian people do not want intervention. So those who claim to be acting on their behalf and using that as a pretext to intervene, there's a contradiction on its face in that position, and that's not being reported here at all.
In some of the other countries we've seen that have took part in the Arab Spring and revolutions, we saw much quicker action, I think it's fair to say. This has been the longest standoff. It's obviously a civil war, and there's lots of talk about perhaps Washington and other countries kind of surpassing any kind of Security Council decision. Do you think we could see a repeat of Iraq? I mean, how likely is foreign intervention really?
It's a tough call to say how likely it is, but certainly all of the moves are being made by the United States to do intervention. I mean, let's be realistic here. The U.S. has been intervening since this uprising, quote unquote, began. The report earlier mentions the fact that these are clearly professional soldiers that are conducting these operations. These are not protesters that decided to grab some rocks or maybe a pistol because of the response of the state to their protests. This is an army that was placed there, either emigres from Syria or just foreign nationals generally, that's being supplied from the outside, from Turkey, the NATO country, from Jordan, and from Lebanon. And so the intervention is already a fact. Whether or not it becomes an overt intervention outside of the UN, which, by the way, is illegal, or takes some other form, the intervention has been underway since this, since the armed struggle, quote unquote, began.
But the peace process has stalled here. Isn't it fair to say that some kind of intervention is needed to stop the violence? I mean, you're talking about, in a way, hidden intervention. I'm talking about blatant intervention, like we saw in Libya.
Yeah, I think that the first thing that needs to happen is there has to be a quarantine of arms into Syria, particularly to, non-governmental sources. No one would allow some foreign power to arm civilians, quote unquote, in the streets or rebel fighters of the United States. That would be an act of war. As long as arms are being, and we're talking tanks and anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons, heavy artillery, as long as that stuff is being placed into the hands of people in Syria and pointed at the government, the idea of peace is laughable. Unfortunately, it's not funny, but it's laughable. And so it has to start there. The introduction of arms into that country that has, been ongoing now for better than a year, that has to stop, and the borders should be placed under international control to make sure that it doesn't happen. From there, then there's a possibility at least of peace, because at least those who are bringing armed struggle against the government will see that they might have to actually make peace, and then the world can judge how that actually happens going forward.
Okay. Anti-war activist and journalist Don Debar with live analysts, with live, I should say, analysis from New York for us this hour. Thanks a lot, Don.
Thank you, Nis.